I guess we're live. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Red May, your month-long vacation from capitalism. Eat red food, wear a red accessory. I have a nice red cast here from breaking my wrist. I don't advise breaking your wrist 2 or 3 weeks ago. And also, read Capital of Grundrisse, or one of the books by our guests tonight. Before I talk about our program tonight, System Crash, what next? I want to clue you in as what's on tap in the next few days. Tomorrow night at 6 p.m., we have What Was Liberalism with Alexander Zevin, Catherine Chaput, Aziz Rana, Michael Bray, and I'll be sitting in on that one at Saturday, May 23rd at 12 p.m. Bottlenecks, Choke Points, and Supply Chains with Charmaine Chua, Lala Khalili, Sandro Mazadra, Deborah Cowan, and Spencer Cox will be, who organizes at Amazon and is also a radical geographer, will be the moderator for that. And so if you want to know more, go to Red May TV at YouTube and subscribe, and you can see everything that's coming up. We have, I don't know, about 10, 14 events left. The one thing we need to keep doing this on our live Red May, which we're going to return to next year, hopefully, if we're not all sheltering in place until then, is we need money. And we need the kindness of strangers. Red May is like Blanche Dubois, as I keep saying. So go to our website, redmayseattle.org, and go to donate. Click on it, give whatever you can, or click on the link beside the YouTube description of our events. But now I would like to introduce the moderator of tonight's event. I think of him as, you know, that book by Anais Nin called A Spy in the House of Love. Doug Henwood was a spy in the House of Wall Street. He worked on Wall Street and wrote a book about it for lefties that's published by Verso that's called Wall Street. It's my first exposure to things like derivatives and so forth. Doug also put out a newsletter, a legendary one called Left Business Observer, which you got an email, which I also subscribe to. But he's probably best known now for the radio show Behind the News, of which this is a kind of a quirky, maybe episode. We'll see. So I'll turn you over to Doug, who will introduce the rest of our panelists, and I will sit back and enjoy what happens.
Yeah, I'm going to cut this down to about 50 minutes or so and make a radio show out of it next week. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work out, but this is like, I'm thinking of this as a live version of Behind the News. I used to do them live on the radio long ago, but now it's all pre-recorded. But what a great array of panelists we have here. I'm just looking from left to right on my screen here. Asad Haider, Jodi Dean, and Leo Panich. And now Philip, of course, has been has turned off his video, so I can't see him anymore. But here we are in just a humdinger of a crisis. Marxism has made itself famous for crisis theory, but I don't think a crisis like this was ever foreseen exactly. And these are twin crises. It's really hard to separate health and economic. They're deeply, deeply intertwined. Politico reported this morning that Georgia, a state that has been leading the opening up movement in the US, also has the highest ratio of unemployment insurance applications to employment of any in the US. So that opening up is not providing any stimulative kick. It's not the shutdown that's causing the economic problem so much as the disease. People are afraid to walk out the door. And it's going to be a long time before people will, in large numbers, are going to go to a restaurant or maybe get their hair cut or do any of the number of very ordinary things that many of us miss very badly. I very badly miss bars and restaurants. I'm sure other people miss other things, but this interruption of social life is very disorienting. And it's also, I mentioned the health and economic crisis, but I think there's probably deep psychological crisis going on too. This is very, very traumatic stuff. People are really stressed and confused. The uncertainty of all this, the risk of death, the feeling how long is this going to go on, the disruption of normal life, the fraying of social ties, and the uncertainty. It's just not how clear we're going to get out of this. It's not clear at all how we're going to get out of this. I mean, I like to say that the Green New Deal seems almost now like a practical solution to our problems. It's just the kind of investment stimulus the economy needs and the social democratic measures that, basic distributive justice requires. And it's no longer really what, Nancy Pelosi once dismissed as the green whatever. But obviously the political obstacles to get anything like this going are huge, given the current structure of the American state. This crisis really was like a cruise missile aimed at the deepest flaws of American society. And excuse my provincial attention to the U.S. here. Maybe with a Canadian here, we can broaden our attention a little more to above the 39th parallel. But the minimal welfare state, the threadbare public health infrastructure, the deeply insane healthcare system driven by profit and not need, extreme even by capitalist standards, and then the vast fissures of class, race, and geography in this country. Add to that the erosion of state capacity that's been long in preparation, but greatly accelerated under Trump. And we can easily understand why we've got some of the worst COVID numbers in the world. Now, for people like us, it's easy to say that the crisis illustrates starkly the choice between socialism and barbarism, but sadly, this is not a universally held opinion. But here we are with disease rampant, GDP on track to shrink by 30 or 35% in the coming months, unemployment rate heading towards 25% or higher, and a response from the government that, despite big dollar signs, has so far meant mostly blank checks for Wall Street and big capital and a pittance for the working class. So we face big challenges of both analysis and activism. So I'd like to open the discussion by bringing up the bourgeois state. Fighting the bourgeois state is always a problem, but our state, the U.S. state, seems particularly ragged and brutal right now. It's almost enough to make you long for a competent neoliberal technocracy. The collapse of state capacity is deeply alarming and threatening to life itself. The Centers for Disease Control, once the world's leading body of that sort, is now people tell me the kind of place that people with good prospects don't even want to go to work anymore. It's showed stunning degrees of incompetence that anybody who's been following this thing for over the long time would find deeply shocking. So how should we think about this? How should we relate to the state? What should our demands be? What can we expect of this bourgeois state? Can we just organize around it through mutual aid, or do we really need to address the state head on and make demands on it that are short of revolutionary demands? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Well,
okay. Were you gonna go, Leah?
Ladies first, Jodi.
So I think, Doug, what I would first want to think a little bit more about is collapse of state capacity versus a kind of destruction and narrowing of state capacity. So it seems like the state has a fairly good capacity to send a lot of money into the pockets of the finance sector and the airlines and particular leading aspects of the bourgeoisie. So it seems quite capable of doing that. It seems like it's also been capable of directing a lot of money into the military. And it's been capable of strengthening police at multiple levels. So I think first it's much more, it's more a matter of the destruction of some aspects of the state and the strengthening of other aspects of the state. And then that suggests that, of course, fighting on that terrain is crucial and necessary. So fighting to direct it to meet social needs, as you know, as even if we know that we're not going to win that fight with the Republicans that we have, much less the Democrats that we are likely to have. I mean, we probably won't win with either one of them, but we can direct our energies towards pushing demands on the state, exposing the fact that there are choices that are made to put efforts in one place rather than another place. So I think, let's think about the destruction of some parts of capacity, and then the recognition that that means that some things can work if you push it.
Anyone else, Leo? Did you seem
I agree
primed?
with that. I think Jodi has put it correctly. I just would say for all of you Americans who, think that everything bad is only going on in the States, that the lack of preparation is visible virtually in every state around the world. Yeah, you can point to Taiwan as an exception. But people point to Germany, but if you read the literature on Germany, there's loads of criticism coming from the left on how inequitous it is and how unprepared it was, and so on. There are variations here, but I do think that one has to say that this is a general problem, not just an American problem. And then at the same time, I think a great deal hinges on some very, very small political vectors as to whether the outcome of this is going to be progressive or reactionary. And a great deal here depends on what happens in the empire. So if it turns out that there is an election in November and the Democrats do win, and especially if they win both houses, I really think that there is an enormous opportunity. Not that I have any expectation that Biden will be a socialist, but I don't think that it is at all implausible that the kind of movement that the American left has thrown up behind Sanders will have the kind of effect that would rebuild state capacities in a progressive way. So, I mean, what looks more rational, as Doug was saying, than the Green New Deal from even a liberal perspective in the face of this crisis? How much sense does it make to have universal health care in the face of it? And one has to say, well, you are right to point to how skewed the means of saving the system is. It is nevertheless the case that the American state has taken on the health expenditures of anybody who ends up in hospital due to COVID-19. That is to be noted. And then in other states, what's quite remarkable is that reactionaries like Boris Johnson are covering 80 to 90% of wages for a significant period, while ideologically covering that by saying there is such a thing as society. This is, after all, the man who is the head of the Tory party, and he is explicitly reneging on Thatcher's theme. And I think that gives us a lot to build on. It allows us, I think, to make inroads of a very significant kind if we're committed enough to it.
Asad, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, Doug, let me say that when you pose the alternative between socialism or barbarism, it's very poignant for me because, as you can see, I very much need to visit a barber. But I will say regarding the state, I think that, to add to the points that have already been made, I think we need to have a vigilance in how we think about the state in two senses. Because in one sense, we know that there are requirements for public health, which require a certain level of control over the population. But we know that the repressive apparatus of the state, if it grows in this sense in response to the crisis, there is very little reason to think that it will roll back its level of control over the population when crisis conditions recede. And so we face that danger of the growth of authoritarianism, which has already been happening under Trump. We can see that in a moment of crisis, authoritarianism can thrive. This is one risk. The second risk, I think, and this is tied to the rise and decline of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which is that we have to be vigilant about the assumption that causing a change in the behavior of the state, causing a change in state policies, will result from entering into the state. Now, a basic tenet of the ideology of parliamentary democracies is that it is by entering into the state that one causes social change. I think that, and this will be, I'm sure, a major part of the discussion that we have this evening, I think that the Marxist critique shows that this is not a tenable assumption. That is, we cannot simply assume that by entering into the state, entering into the capitalist state, we are able to change its character. So I think this is the second note on which we must be vigilant.
I wanted to just hold up a couple of things that Leo said. I thought they were really great. And that's the society exists and basically planning, right? The saying that no one was prepared means an absence of planning. And so there's a way that that there's a socialist platform that's quite that's easier to make now than it's been in a long time. And that's arguing for the imperative of planning. Like that's common sense at this point. Everybody has to recognize the necessity of planning and that society exists. And that's a huge move away from the neoliberal ideology that's been so dominant. So I think those are good places to stand, good legs to stand on for, you know, the upcoming politics and upcoming political struggles that we have to have. I think I'm less worried about authoritarianism than Assad. I think that Trump has been characterized, I wouldn't characterize him so much as authoritarian as I would sort of single-minded on a few things that matter to him, basically his own ratings and his possibilities of re-election, and those hinge on how particular parts of his base respond to him. But I don't think he's been bent on oppressing everyday people. I think he's been, the worst part of his authoritarianism has been the deportation strategies, but that's a continuation of Obama. So I don't think that that counts there. And I don't think that it's the control over population is what's been going on. We've seen huge numbers of people across the United States basically pushing against any kind of state regulation on their behavior in the name of some kind of so-called, you know, they're free to spread the virus or free not, you know, to do whatever they please. So I think authoritarianism is less the worry than the absence of a state doing the kinds of things that a state should be doing, namely securing public health, securing a general level of well-being, securing the provision of basic kinds of material like the ventilators and the PPE. And then the last thing is, I actually don't think any Marxists think that just being in parliamentary government means that you win anything. I mean, that's just one of the terrains of fighting, one of the terrains on which people struggle. It doesn't mean getting there is the victory. Getting there is the starting point for another level of fighting, another level of attempt, and of course, failures will come. So I think I would push against that characterization of how Marxists think about participation in parliamentary or bourgeois governments.
Jodi, you mentioned the obvious need for planning, and I hear a lot of people across the spectrum, but pretty far on the left, just talking about universal basic income, grants, monetary interventions. But I don't really hear much people talking about intervening in the productive structure, rearranging it, or hijacking it for production, medical equipment. But I'll just, also if we're talking about a Green New Deal, it's going to require massive interventions in the public, in the productive sector that, the only precedent in American history for would be World War II mobilization. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about that. I hear, like I said, people talking about checks for everyone, but I don't hear people really talking much about how to reorganize production in any meaningful way.
Well, if I could say, Doug, I think the opening is there to do so. Precisely by virtue of the way in which General Electric has taken on producing equipment that's necessary for personal protection and indeed for hospital ventilation. The fact that Trump had to use the Defense Production Act to get General Motors to do the same gives us a basis for making this case. I do think that it isn't hard to make the step in this direction. And I also, want to respond to Asad's, I think, important point. Of course, in some ways, in my view, it's better that Bernie didn't win. I mean, there was even if it was always going to be harder for him to win the Democratic nomination than to win the presidency anyway. But because the preparation for implementation was not there, just as it wasn't with Syriza in Greece. So while everybody was enthusiastic about policy or arguing about different policies, etc., there was very little strategic concentration on how the heck will we actually implement this stuff. And so when we turn towards it's necessary to enter the state to change it, we need to do that from the perspective of having time to work through how to implement the policies. What would it take to develop now a state that is capable of actually implementing a Green New Deal and all of the construction involved in that, given the way state capacities have been diminished? But also, how does one build a degree of support? So in face of the enormous opposition, one can carry people with you. So I think the movement building is connected to the strategy for getting into the state. It's not something separate from it. And as regards, just finish with this, the repressive apparatus, of course, but, come on. What has happened now in terms of tracing, compared to the capacity of the security intelligence establishment, not only in the United States, but in the Five Eyes, to track down us lefties, this really doesn't add to much more than that. Really. And as Jodi said, I was astonished this week, just a little vignette. I was driving by the provincial legislature on Saturday to go for a long walk on the lake. And there were people gathered there, and one of them, a woman, was holding a sign saying we are all essential workers. And as a good lefty, when I see with something that looks like a protest or a picket line, I honked. And then I realized that those people they were all wearing fatigues. They were, led by some gun lobby here in Ontario. And they were protesting the fact that there was, preparations being made here in Ontario in a very conservative government to not allow people to yet to go back to work. I think, who we need to worry about and what I fear is that Trump, on the basis of supporters like that, will go even further to do away with what elements of the rule of law and accountability have been built into the American system. In doing away with inspectors general, this is the most dangerous, I think, development that can be visited on the American system.
I think we should keep perspective on these protesters. There are not that many of them.
Yeah.
They're organized by right-wing forces, and the public really doesn't support them. And they get a lot of attention. So like if you have a strike by Amazon workers or a demonstration by nurses looking for masks, that doesn't get anywhere near the coverage that these lunatics get, because the media just likes the sensation and really don't want to cover anything that doesn't fit the bourgeois agenda. So let's not get too worried about them, although they are scary and heavily armed. So now we're all dancing around the electoral issue here. Is Trump so dangerous that displacing him is a top priority, even if it's just for Sleepy Joe, or is that something that socialists should leave to the bourgeois order to decide? Asad, you seemed unwilling to be persuaded by the importance of going for Biden.
Well, I think that, I commented earlier, I think a lot of the discussion, it corresponds to a kind of psychoanalytic logic of fantasy. Many liberals are quite scandalized that young radicals aren't enthusiastic for Biden. But whether that has anything to do with what the outcome of the election will be is totally unclear. The fantasy.
Well, they're looking for somebody to blame.
What's that?
They're looking for somebody to blame.
Looking for somebody to blame because the Democratic Party has so consistently bungled this. Yes, absolutely. But I think that there's what we're seeing now. I mean, the young leftists who are skeptical of Biden because they were mobilized by the Sanders campaign are unlikely to constitute a meaningful voting bloc that could actually sway the election, and they don't sway public opinion. So I think that the discussion is actually one between competing conceptions of politics and what's politically possible. Is it possible and necessary to advance a conception of politics that goes beyond the limitations of the two-party system? Or do we have to continue to accept year after year, election after election, the premise that politics is reducible to the defense of the status quo against what is perceived to be the exceptional threat? I think that's what's really at stake. And I think many people are demonstrating a kind of anxiety about the exceptional threat, which is standing in the way of the courage that it takes to fight for real change.
Jodi or Leo, any
Well,
response?
I would say that there is no real change that you're going to secure on the basis of one election. That's certainly true. But it is also, I think, mistaken to think that it wouldn't matter that after this mobilization behind Sanders, that a Democratic administration would get in and introduce some labor legislation that would make it easier to engage in the process of class formation. That should be the most important outcome of what's happened since 2016. It's not that the system is going to be changed by Biden, of course not. But even apart from the Popular Front strategy of keeping the fascists out, there's reason to believe, given what has been accomplished by young people on the American left in the last 3-4 years by way of mobilization, that can have some effects. And we should only look at those effects in terms of what does it then open up in terms of further mobilization. And that matters. I have to say that not to be worried about the loss of the rule of law in a bourgeois democratic capitalist state seems to me also mistaken. Above all, what is being done by way of the loss of accountability is very, very significant, I think.
I was just talking to Jane McAlevey the other day, who said that if you're trying to organize a union, just personnel in the NLRB really matter. And even if it's Biden, it's going to be a lot better than anything that happens under Trump. So that was an angle I hadn't thought of before. But also the degree of absolute incompetence, really, like I said, it almost makes me nostalgic for neoliberal technocracy. Watching this, the management of this pandemic under Trump has been alarming. And the class of people around him are such a frightening array of parasites and fools and incompetence that it just seems like a house cleaning really is in order.
The thing is, though, is that is this election one that would give us such a house cleaning? Like Leo was making a point that I was finding pretty persuasive regarding the kind of breakdown of the rule of law and the firing of the inspector general? Is that the right title? And that this is, and there's a lot of stuff that's utterly outrageous about the illegal behavior of the people of the Trump administration. And yet I don't see a strong Democratic Party leadership making any headway on this. I don't see them offering up any kind of real courageous opposition. I don't see them fighting that battle. And I think, Leo, I would be a little bit more persuaded if there was a Democratic Party that was exercising any of the kind of defense of let's say democratic law or rule of law in a visible and strong sense. And I don't think we see that. So I'm less compelled to think of this particular election that way. And so I'm less compelled by the analogy with the LRB than I would be otherwise. Yeah, so I think that that not thinking in terms of the election, but thinking in terms of mobilization, how do you mobilize people? What are you mobilizing for? That to me makes a lot more sense as a political framing than the kind of myopia of this one particular election.
I was very cheered to see that in the month or so since Sanders dropped out, though, that DSA has added about 10,000 members. And I'm sure some people would say DSA isn't a socialist organization, but that's impressive that there has not been a collapse, but quite the opposite. It seems like a different kind of fresh energy coming out of that, a sense that we're really in this for the long haul, and that the presidency is a pretty steep hill to climb, but there's a lot of other political work to be done.
Can I just clarify so Asad can respond fully to this? I wasn't suggesting, Jodi, that the Democrats are mobilized to prevent this. I just think that when they're in office, they will simply not do this. That is, they operate within the framework of the bourgeois democratic status quo domestically, very largely, and the institutional structures therein. I also agree with Doug that the degree of running down of state apparatuses in just bourgeois democratic terms in relation to the Department of Energy, in relation, well, as we know, with the State Department, et cetera, is something that even the Democrats would not have done. Now, one can criticize them plenty for still having tried to, secure equipment in relation to pandemics through the private sector, and that's what we should be doing. And it was a big order that they made back in 2013 that didn't get filled because the concentration of capital had one giant firm take over a smaller firm that they made that contract, and they didn't fulfill the contract because the price was lower than they wanted to deliver the goods at. So, the socialist critique needs to be made, but I do think we are wrong not to be seeing the extent to which this administration is not only running down the apparatus, just in a technical sense, but is engaged in, I think, tarnishing the rule of law in a really problematic way. And why does that matter? It matters because the left needs space to engage in mobilization. And the more democratic space is closed down, the less we're able to do that, unless you think that we can develop the arms to carry through an insurrection that the far right can't. And I still think Gramsci was right about that as regards to advanced capitalist states.
We all have to join the Socialist Rifle Association now. Asad, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly which portion of Gramsci you're referring to, because I think, he remains committed to the ultimate vision of insurrection. But that aside,
you have to have a debate about that. That's
I think would Biden would it be better to have Biden than Trump? Probably, though we don't know that Sleepy Joe would actually represent the smooth running of the neoliberal technocracy as you suggest, Doug. I see a great level of incompetence there too. I think we need to specify what we're talking about when we talk about the state. I don't think we can say in the abstract, what should the state be doing now? What would the state's role be? This is once again posing it in the abstract. We're talking about a capitalist state. The capitalist state is interested in our health insofar as we are the bearers of labor power. It will also preserve the conditions in which we are dependent on the market and have to sell our labor power to survive. If these interests conflict, it may opt for the latter. I think we have to keep this in mind. And so the expectation that the state is simply the space of the protection of the public good is not, I think, a sustainable conception for the capitalist state. I think next we have to consider, Leo, your teacher, Ralph Miliband, made a point, which was also made by his theoretical adversary, Nikos Poulantzas, at the end of the 1970s, which is that if you have a struggle which enters into the state, you must have forms of organization which are outside of the state. which not only are able to lend support for social democratic reforms, but also exert pressure, exert a fundamental challenge to the ultimately capitalist balance of forces which prevails in the state. And frankly, I've seen a lot of discussion on the socialist left about how we can use electoral politics in our favor, but I have not seen an attempt to elaborate how these electoral efforts can be tied to the development of directly democratic organizations outside the state, which can build what Miliband confusingly called dual power. But that discussion, I think, is not happening. What are the forms of organization outside of the state which will be able to make any meaningful reform possible?
I got an audience question here, which is relevant to this. Is this discussion a question as to if the state is the horizon of necessary action today? Are we focusing too much on the state here?
I'll say yes. I do think the state is let's say like a temporary horizon for action today. Like, I don't think that we move away from capitalism or an exploitative capitalist system without the state. I think we can't pretend that forms now, say civil society organizations and non-state actors will have any of the centralizing capacity to take on capital in any strong sense. So I think that we have to talk about the state. But I also think that the state is, of course, much more complicated than the language of state lets us say, right? Like, on the one hand, I mean, Assad's of course right when he mentions that, well, we're talking about a capitalist state, but it's also the case that within the capitalist state, there are multiple different constituencies, there are different elements of it, right? There's a massive bureaucracy that has its own sets of interest. There's a military that has its own sets of interest. And so it's not, we don't help our conversation if we act as if the state is that kind of a unity that we can say that it only cares, as if the state cares at all. I mean, that seems like a strange kind of locution. So I will say the state is a necessary instrument, and we can't get around it.
So do we smash the state? Do we transform it? Do we use it to our advantage? What's the approach to the state?
Marx is very clear on this. I'll just say.
Well, okay. Finish that thought, please.
I think it's absolutely clear in the Marxist tradition that smashing the state is part of the aim of a socialist revolutionary politics. What does this mean? It means that the centralized repressive apparatus, which is separate from people and stands over them in their everyday lives, has to be abolished and replaced by mass organizations in which people are able to participate in the decisions that rule over their lives. I think, this is not an extreme or outlandish view, but this is what was meant by smashing the state. I think it remains a basic emancipatory principle.
Leo, you're not coming through here.
You're muted, Leo.
I meant to unmute myself. I have to say, your characterization of Poulantzas and Miliband on this, Asad, it is contrary to what they were actually writing when they wrote this stuff. Their whole point was to criticize the smash the state metaphor. Their whole point was actually, Miliband used, call it dual power if you like, in order to identify the necessity of going into the state and transforming it while building support outside and capacities outside to be able to go in and change it. What they were precisely criticizing, and of course, traditional Leninists traduced Poulantzas for this. I saw this myself in England just before Poulantzas died, where he was attacked for this, for criticizing the dual power notion, in the sense, for ridiculing it. The notion that you can build institutional capacities to plan and govern and especially in a democratic way, complex societies without transforming the apparatuses and institutions are there. Even Lenin by 1922 said, all we've done is occupy the institutions of the Tsarist state. There was nothing left of the Soviets by that time, and they didn't have the capacity to. They could be expressions of democratic sentiment, of building collective identity and will, but their administrative capacity was practically zero. We need to be thinking in terms of democratic administration, and that's what Marx said to Bakunin. When Bakunin attacked him for being a statist, he defended what he had laid out by way of state apparatuses after the Paris Commune and said, if you want to call it a state, call it a state. I mean, it is absolutely, I think, enormously important in our time that there has been a shift from the protest movements, which were very important, from Seattle to Occupy, towards taking that energy and directing it in part to making reform demands on the state, and one would hope going beyond that to implementing a change in the state apparatus so that those reforms could open up transformative change. But that can't be done, as I was saying to begin with, and I agree with you, Asad, without the much, much more important thing, which is to take those movements which are oriented to getting into the state and use them to build class capacities outside. And I must say, most practically, that would have to entail taking public sector unions, like the ones that are, whose workers are seeing us through this terrible pandemic, and encouraging them to develop the capacities to change those apparatuses, whether they're hospitals, whether they're departments of health, whether they are planning apparatuses. For now, the public sector unions don't have that on their agenda. They don't see public sector workers' leaders as cadre for changing the state. That's what Marx was talking about.
Jodi, any thoughts?
I think I agree a lot with Leo. And I also think, especially if we're thinking about this in terms of where are we right now, what does a transition look like? What are the tasks that we see before us in the next few years? That what he says makes a great deal of sense. Is that the same thing as the overcoming of capitalism? No. But is it a step towards building the kinds of class and movement and capacity and collective leadership that's necessary? I think yes. So I think that we don't do ourselves any favors when we talk right now about smashing the state. It seems to me that actually takes us back to the beginning of the conversation with the way that the Trump administration has in effect destroyed the capacity of the state to intervene in ways that benefit public health, that benefit people's well-being, that are basically that generate a kind of capacity to do what a state should do if it weren't just a capitalist state. So I think it kind of comes full circle where smashing the state seems to be what the far right does.
No, but the state has done a great deal to support capital. The state has great capacity. It has enormous willingness to act and intervene in the economy to defend capital. We've seen it happen. That's what's happening right now. What a state should do when it's a capitalist state is precisely to defend the interests of capital. It's doing what it should do. That's the problem. Now, I think to go to Leo's point, of course it's correct. Both Miliband and Poulantzas are criticizing the conception of smashing the state, and they are advancing this other conception. What's the problem? Why is it that smashing the state did not lead to the institution of Soviet power, of direct democracy on the model of the Soviet? Why? Because there was a gap between the direct democracy of the Soviets and the centralized structure of the capitalist state, which was filled in by the party. This was the problem. There was no theory of forms of organization that could go beyond the centralized party and that could provide an alternative to the centralized structure of the capitalist state. This, I think, was a very important insight of both Miliband and Poulantzas. And so I think this is a problem that we face now. I don't think that we are able to think of organization when, you know, people talk about getting organized, going beyond horizontalism and getting organized. What model do we have that's an alternative to the classical form of the party or simply to the form of the bourgeois parliamentary party? Do we have an alternative to Leninist vanguardism or to bourgeois parliamentarism? Do we have another conception of organization? I think, honestly, the critique of horizontalism by now has become somewhat glib because we have electoral movements that socialists are getting behind, but we don't have a theory of how is it that we, you know, Leo, you alluded to public sector unions, but I don't know if that's enough to present an alternative model of democracy to parliamentary democracy.
No, it certainly isn't. And I think what we've all been doing in our different ways is precisely trying to think our way through to the type of class agencies that are capable of seeing through a socialist transformation. And I certainly agree that one doesn't start with the state. One starts with trying to build those agencies. It's been obvious to my generation since the 60s that the mass parties of the working class that emerged between the 1870s and World War I, or even in the 1920s, had lost their capacity to do that by the 1960s. What my generation has not managed to do, and I hope yours will, is develop new mass parties capable of that and having themselves the institutional apparatus and framework to be more horizontalist and be more capacity building, to be directive vis-a-vis public sector unions in terms of you need to be developing your members as cadre to change the state. And that isn't going to be done without building such parties. The trouble is, yes, there isn't a formula for this. We are in a process of discovering how to do this. We have things to learn from the mistakes that were made. We have things to learn from those who tried to turn both communist parties and social democratic ones into agencies like that and failed to do so. That's why I've just finished this book on the project of the Labor New Left, from Ben to Corbyn. They were searching for socialism above all in that sense. Much more importantly, in terms of how do we democratize these parties, make them agencies of mass education and capacity building, rather than just policy machines. That was precisely what the project was about. And the likelihood of transforming a party like Labor, of course, was always pretty small. But one can learn from that in terms of developing the capacity, I hope, in the 21st century to build such parties.
And Jodi, a lot of talk about parties. Any thoughts?
Yeah. First, what I still want to push back on Assad that the capitalist state is doing what it should do and doing what it's supposed to do. I mean, actually, we're in a situation of pretty incredible, like close to economic collapse with like 40 million people unemployed, the pressure on the different states in the U.S. for unemployment breaking their budgets. We've got the total upheaval back and forth in the stock market and a real crisis around the economy and production. So it seems like it doesn't make sense to say that this state is doing what a state should do, or just saying, well, it's doing that, but it just does it completely badly. So I will push there. And then on organizational question, I think that the Vanguard Party idea is not over and should still be considered, emphasized, fought for, energy put into, and that there were mistakes in the past, that it didn't work doesn't mean it can't work, that it's irretrievable. But that's the kind of thing there is, like, what is it, like the proof of the pudding is in the cooking or in the making, whatever that kind of cliche is. I mean, we see what, we have to do the work and see what happens. So it's almost like I think this goes back to what Leah was saying. It's like there's a kind of period of now experimentation, whether or not it's at the level of the unions, more energy is going back into unions than there has been in a long time, at least in the United States, particularly unions that are in these areas of social reproduction, like nurses and teachers and public sector. That's important. And then we have a return to the mainstream parties and party work, like with around Corbyn and Sanders. And then we have the kind of organized socialists between the kind of mainstream DSA and then the other smaller parties. And so it's not like we have to attack any one of these. Rather, it's like we need to invest in them, invest our energies and time, and try to forward all of them to have a really thriving ecosystem. And if I think about like the 30s, the 30s, there were multiple kinds of communist and socialist organizations, all the way through civil society, education, unions, and the parties. So it wasn't like, we have to trash this kind as vanguardist so that the other ones would flourish.
I got a question here from Philip, our host. Forget Biden. Imagine Bernie or AOC elected president. Their challenge is not to get grotesquely undemocratic state institutions to deliver outcomes they can't. Like Allende, their challenge is to mobilize part of the state and the movement outside it to destroy those grotesque institutions by delegitimating them. But yeah, what would a Bernie or an AOC in office be capable of doing?
Very little, something, and it would depend, of course, on the balance of forces in the Democratic Party and in the Congress after they got in. But I think it would have proved rather disappointing. Both, not only because there weren't the forces built from the outside, but also because the implementation planning wasn't there. Even insofar as one assumes that what they're about is what we seem to be all agreeing on, which is that we're trying to change a capitalist state into something that would be on the road to becoming a socialist one. I entirely agree with Asad that the main function of the capitalist state is to reproduce capital accumulation and class relations of production. Of course, that's the case. That said, the state, nevertheless, with that function, is a field of struggle. And I think to bury our heads in the sand, as we see around us so much opportunity to carry that struggle inside the state, as people point to essential workers, as people back essential workers, frontline workers, poor workers, this gives us an opportunity for mobilization around a class politics that takes us somewhere. You can't merely appeal to people on the basis of the long run goal of socialism. You have to articulate that, you have to make them want it, you have to offer people immediate reforms. You don't have to tell a Leninist that. That's what Lenin knew. That's why it was peace and bread. You have to offer people that. And we have an enormous opportunity in the current conjuncture to be able to advancing that. When right-wingers are carrying signs saying we are all essential workers, we have to turn that into our slogan with our meaning, rather than say, well, 50 years from now, we'll build a kind of socialist party that will be able to carry through an insurrection.
Your response to that?
I agree with that. On our local level, what's been really, I live in Geneva, New York, and it's a town of about 12,000 people in between Rochester and Syracuse. And we've been doing the kind of celebrate or thank essential workers solidarity action every night at 6 o'clock. And what's been so interesting is there's been a struggle over the definition in the community over the definition of essential workers, where the right wing is trying to always say first responders are essential workers, and by where first responders really they mean police. And so they keep wanting to make this a pro-police action, where, you know, our group is like, no, we started this. This is like, we're talking about the non-citizen agricultural workers, the farm workers, the hospital workers, the people in the grocery store, the delivery people. That's what we're talking about. We're even talking about, you know, all of the, you know, the people having to take care of their kids at home, right? That's essential labor now. All of the teachers who are having to teach from remote, that's essential labor. But so it's been real, but it's interesting that the struggle is around who's an essential worker. And when I'm now, so that's full stop on that point. When I get depressed, I start to think, oh God, you know, where the way this is going to start to look is that the essential workers are going to go back to just be these awful kind of capitalist finance tech people as the real workers, right? The ones who we all depend on, you know, start to be forced back to work, right? I'm really worried about how this essential worker struggle is going to be. Like, are they really is there really going to be like does this help build the kind of support to enable strikes? Does this build the support to enable essential workers not to go back to work? Or are we going to keep getting this twisted where somehow the essential nature of these workers starts to vanish? I don't know. I think it's a real front line of politics right now.
When I take a walk into Bed-Stuy at 7 o'clock, we have our applause for this essential workers here at 7. And I notice always just ordinary working class people, many of them, you know, people of color, out there cheering wildly. I used to think this, you know, the cheering for the essential workers was kind of a upper middle class gesture, noblesse oblige or something. But no, it was really something that the working class, at least, you know, in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, seems to feel very deeply. So I think your pessimism isn't fully earned at this point, Jodi. It seems like there is a lot of solidarity and a lot to build upon if we can, you know, God knows what's going to happen over the next several months, but there is something going on there that's really moving. And it's visible, I think, even to a lot of capitalists, just how crucial real workers are. I mean, all these years we've been hearing, you know, it's the creative class and it's like, information is a directly productive force. All these things we've heard, you know, the tales of capitalism have been telling for the last 20, 25 years, now revealed to be absolute nonsense. And the importance of regular workers just to keep the system going is very obvious, I think, just about everyone. And part of the failure of the state at this point is yes, it's about protecting capital, but it also needs to deliver a working class that's capable of producing value. And it's not able to do that right now. It's failing that very badly. And that is a failure, you know, both in human terms, but also a failure to the capitalists. So the capitalist state, or the American capitalist state, seems to have blown a gasket.
But I would qualify, Doug, you know, Marxist crisis theory is easily caricatured, as Philip did earlier, saying, you know, Marxists have predicted 20 of the last 15 crises. But at the same time, there's a very important rational kernel of crisis theory, which is that crises are an integral aspect of the capitalist economy. The anarchy of capitalist competition will result in periodic crises. That's programmed into the capitalist system. The capitalist state can step in to try to manage these crises, but it can't eliminate them. They will happen. And I think that we have to keep that in mind. I also think it's worthwhile to make a distinction about essential workers. I mean, the solidarity is very important. The recognition of the sacrifices people are making is very important. But I think this has to be distinguished from moving towards talking about, let's say, the dignity of labor, a phrase that Marx caricatured and ridiculed a great deal. Because what we're talking about is a form of extreme exploitation. You know, if we talk about the dignity of labor, we can cover up the fact that essential laborers are essential because they are hyper exploited. They are subjected to the most dangerous conditions. It's not so much that we should defend the heroism of that kind of labor, but say that people should be liberated from this. I think that this should be a socialist demand, to say that people should not be subjected to this kind of labor, rather than celebrating its dignity.
One of the great ironies at the moment is that a lot of people who have led campaigns against the modern sweatshops in the global clothing industry, people on the left are now saying, my God, these people in Bangladesh are dependent on these jobs and global value chains are being disrupted in this crisis. And we have to keep some perspective here. I entirely agree. That said, you're not going to get anywhere insofar as you aren't supporting these workers in their struggles for better working conditions and better remuneration, while encouraging a change in the apparatuses in which they're working so that they are ambitious enough to be demanding democratic control over the labor process, and over investment decisions, et cetera. Look, we have an enormous opportunity. I won't speak to the United States, but here in Canada, capital is so on the defensive. Liberal governments are so on the defensive for having left nursing homes in the hands of private profit operators. It's shown in the context of the crisis here, 80% of the deaths here have been in nursing homes. Well, the ratio is 10 deaths for every 3 in the private sector, for every 3 in the municipally owned sector. And this is gives us an enormous chance to make the case for public ownership. We have a government in Ontario that did not introduce a minimum wage increase when it came in, that was due to come in this year. It is now, it has raised the incomes of frontline, very low paid, largely immigrant workers in the health sector, in the nursing care sector, by $4 an hour to almost $20. This gives people confidence. It doesn't mean they're not exploited, of course, but it gives people confidence, and they become an example for others to struggle. And I do think Amazon is on the defensive, right, in the strikes that have taken place. We need to take advantage of this. Not say it doesn't matter. All these people want is, no, it's true that Amazon is forcing them to work in unsafe conditions, that the state is forcing people to work in unsafe conditions without proper PPE equipment. It's true. And it's true that when people have tried to get labor boards to let them not work, they haven't succeeded in doing so. Well, that's our struggle for the moment, while being explicitly socialist and being explicitly explanatory in terms of the nature of this state.
Just to add one bit to Leo's point, I mean, that so many companies are they're pushing back against things like adequate PPE or adequate distancing, lets you know that that is actually a site of struggle, like a temporary site of struggle. It's like they're afraid of workers having victories right there. So think about like the meat plants, the meat processing plants, right? If you slowed down those assembly lines, and if you spaced out the workers more, then there would be some version of some very slight diminution of their exploitation, very slight, but some very slight improvement in their working condition. But the corporations are even fighting against that small bit. So I think thinking about these as step-by-step struggles, as sites to build and win, and then build again and win again, is absolutely crucial. And that this is more than a kind of sentimental approach to hero workers. It's about building the community support that enables strikes to win, right? Strikes require the support of the community to endure and win.
Yeah, it seems like capital has had everything go its way for so long now that even the slightest reversal of that looks terrifying to them, because I think they're just afraid that the slightest step will result in another step and another one after that, and their whole course of victory over the last 40 years will be undone. And I think they seem very vulnerable, and the slightest move in that direction could unleash quite disruptive actions. I mean, we're seeing these small, not necessarily very well organized strikes around Amazon, Whole Foods, Instacart. But there's an awful lot of promise there that could go somewhere over time.
I have to say, at least here, capital is almost apologetic. Even
that's a Canadian way.
Even right-wing commentators are suddenly saying what a scandal it was to leave the nursing care sector in private hands. The producers of the meat packers are all apologetic. The scandal of cutting back on inspectors in the meatpacking sector, everybody is defensive about this. I do think in that sense, this is an opportunity. I don't see capital actually wringing its hands with worry over what is happening, except in the sense that they seem apologetic about it.
I got a question here. This is quite a change of topic, but the role of the central banks has been enormous in this crisis. And how should we think about this? Like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., Jerome Powell has been one of the more humane public figures in positions of power in what he's been saying. But also the level of policy mobilization coming from the central banks has been very, very impressive. How should socialists think about this? Is there a way that, people are always talking about democratizing finance. There's a way that these central bank interventions can be pushed in a more constructive direction other than just, bailing out a bunch of speculators and private equity guys?
Sorry, I would say that one needs to begin where Asad did. Central banks are quintessentially capitalist institutions, and their expertise is at putting out fires. And the Treasury called the Fed a firefighter, and its own connection with it firefighting all the way through the 1990s, and they were right. I think what we don't recognize, however, often enough, is that everybody is dependent, is tied into and dependent on this financial system that the Fed is reproducing. It isn't, when banks are just bailed out, you have to remember that we now have a massification of finance in capitalism. This isn't just high finance that is bailed out. It's the teachers' pension plans, right? And in that sense, we're all connected into this system. There's a certain irony in how good the Fed is at doing this. And it's been good at it because of independent central banking. We've been critical of it quite rightly because we say this means that democratic elected governments can't tell central bankers who have been mainly concerned about inflation that they ought to be opening up the money taps to allow people to secure full employment, et cetera. In this particular crisis, what one sees is that independent central banking has been to the benefit of everyone, unless you think that a massive collapse of this system would have yielded socialism, which it would not have done. It would have yielded something much, much uglier than that. So ironically, given a Trump administration, given a Johnson administration in the UK, the independence of the central banks has allowed them to intervene in a very capable way in capitalist terms to keep the system going. The crisis, however, wasn't initially a financial one. The crisis is a production one, and is brought about not because of the pandemic directly. It's brought about not because capitalists stopped producing on their own. It's because capitalist states told them to stop producing, made them stop producing. Now one needs to think about, why did they do that? And I'm not sure the answer is, well, they're doing everything in the interest of capital. Yes, I suppose in the most abstract sense, you need to have the workers to work, so they don't want them all to die. But the crisis was created by states, mainly cynical politicians being responsive to people who thought they would die, actually intervening to stop production. And then, of course, finance would seize up. It wasn't a crisis rooted in financial instability, although the irrationality of the system, as Asad says, means that is always there. In this particular case, it was a production crisis. And the production was stopped by the state telling production to stop.
The state, in the U.S., we're seeing great tensions in the federal system here because the central government has done virtually nothing along those lines. It's all been state governors and only certain regions of the country where it's really been active. Jodi and I talked about this on the show the other week, that, is this some sort of, hint of fractures in the American federal system? You've got this compact with the Western states, the Northeastern states, sort of coordinating their actions to manage the crisis together because there's a vacuum coming out of Washington. And then you have the Southern states moving rapidly to try to reopen as much as possible. What does this say about, when we talk about the state as a unitary thing, but, the federal system in this country is very complicated and full of contradictions and fissures.
It seems to me that there's these sort of interesting tendencies in different directions between the kind of functioning central banks that Leo's talking about, and then the fragmenting U.S. federal system that we talked about a week or so ago. It's fairly shocking that the Trump administration would force states to compete with each other, that the Senate is happily saying things like, well, we don't want to have any benefits for, wait, which one? We're the only country in the world that calls the red states the conservative states. Wait, there are no benefits for the states with Democratic governors or the coastal non-Trump supporting states. So we've seen this like strange politics of that hasn't been a moment of national unity or pulling together, really not at all like what we saw in Australia, which has been much more unified, New Zealand. Instead, I think that it is not crazy to think about the U.S. operating much more regionally, particularly now since the whole, going back to work, reopening part is also being done in such a fragmented, disparate way that this could really be something like the forerunner of something like a kind of breakdown of the system of a unified U.S. system, like happened in the Soviet Union.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I thought Asad hadn't been in for a while, so I'd give him a chance. But I can respond to this if you like. Go ahead.
No, I'll just say, this is an important point, which is that as long as we remain within the constraints of capitalist social relations, our lives are subordinated to the health of capitalist accumulation. A state restoring conditions of capitalist profitability will be better for our livelihoods. That's the limitation that we live under. So that's certainly true, but it means that we will constantly be subjected to this kind of disruption and turbulence, which is an inherent aspect of the capitalist system until we are able to change those property relations. I would say the second point about the state, we can consider two things about the state. First of all, there's the old idea of the relative autonomy of the state. The state only can serve the interests of capital insofar as it is independent in some sense from the class struggle directly. It does have to protect workers' lives. It has to be independent from the interests of every individual capital. Capitalists are in competition. It has to stand above that. And so I don't think we see a contradiction there between the capitalist character of the state and the fact that the capitalist state appears to serve the public good. It must do that in order to serve the interests of capital. That actually is the mechanism. But at the same time, it's not, there is no one direct way of serving the public good. There's no one obvious way of managing the crisis. So we certainly see factions in the capitalist state. We see different strategies being proposed. This is why we had neoliberalism, authoritarian populism. We had the emergence of these different strategies of managing crises and of managing the instability of the capitalist economy. And we will see these tendencies at war. We see it now in the conflicts between states and the federal government, as you say, or between different states. I think that, for me, all of this only goes to reinforce that we must think of the state as a capitalist state. All of this shows the complexity of the operation of the capitalist state.
But how well does the capitalist class know its interests? Can it organize on its own, or does it need, political parties and a state to organize its interests, to make it aware of its own interests? And are our current structures doing that right now?
I entirely agree with what Asad just laid out. I think that's absolutely correct. And that's the way to think about this. And while, as you've shown, Doug, there are moments in which ruling classes have a greater capacity to discern their own interests, develop the kind of institutions, the Council on Foreign Relations, et cetera, outside the state that allows them to articulate, to coalesce a common view. In general, because the capitalist class is competing by its very nature with one another, it becomes the function, as Poulantzas said, of the capitalist state to organize the capitalist class. Now, that is always done in a very jerky way, a very uneven way, et cetera. And as he also said, if you ask the general question of how relatively autonomous is the state, his answer to that was, I can't answer that in the abstract. It depends on the specific society, the specific conjuncture, the specific history and nature of the state apparatus. And what has been the case in the United States for a very long time is that it has had less autonomy from particular class interests. That's what all the lobbying is about, than other states, capitalist states, have often had. There's a certain irony in the case of this Trump administration. In some senses, these guys are serving their own interests or their mafia collaborators' interests in many respects. In other respects, they're highly autonomous from pressures from the ruling class. And that's what has Wall Street tearing its hair out sometimes when they're not being given the tax breaks. Now, I'm not sure that Jodi's right that nothing has been done at the federal level outside of the Fed. I mean, after all, the $3.5 trillion that's been spent is not all thrown directly at businesses, at big businesses, by any means. And many of the small businesses it's thrown at are at the very low end of the petty bourgeoisie. And in fact, people are going in and out of the working class. So
that's not really
so far as you're right, the states have done, it has been at the state level where healthcare is responsibility lies, that most of this has taken place. What the federal state has done is facilitated this, albeit in a very contradictory way. The state governors could not have done it unless what was done with at the federal level. Absolutely.
The small business assistance program is a massive failure. It's not getting to anyone. It's very badly distributed. It's the way they distribute it through banks has been a total administrative nightmare. But it's the New York Fed did a study of where the money has gone. Nebraska has gotten far more than New York has. So it's been a massive failure.
Well, no,
basically
but
the bailout is hands out to Boeing and airlines. Yeah. Jodi, you looked
Yeah, I was going to say something also about basically the fiasco that has been what was supposed to be support for small businesses, and also the real failures of people's inability to be able to access unemployment. That's a failure at multiple levels, both state and federal levels. The problems of getting the very small $1,200 check, which also didn't go to lots of people who would have needed it. So I think that, yes, there's been a little bit more. You're right on that part, Leo. But I think that overall, it just doesn't look like a successful federal level response at all. It looks like a big mess.
That's good. You should be pointing that out. But the vast majority of people have been able to eat. How have they been able to eat?
Well, no, there's a lot of
Either they've
hunger
had their own
crisis.
savings, or the food stamp program has been expanded. It's been expanded a lot.
That they actually the distribution of handout food, right, like by community organizations, is doing an enormous amount of work in across the country. So I think without that, I mean, people would be starving, right? Without these kinds of community-based program, people would actually be starving. I think that that trying to give the federal government here credit for that,
It's not credit. It's looking at this the way Asad was speaking of. Now, maybe those of us who live outside the United States have a more, sensible or jaundiced view. I don't know how you want to put it. But there's no question that capitalist states have played a very important role, in providing means of subsistence to the vast majority of the population who haven't been able to work in this crisis. There's no doubt about it.
True. It's just not.
Now, maybe
really
it's not true in the States, but it sure is true everywhere else.
Not in the United States. It's not. The Financial Times had a story a couple of weeks ago about the Swiss program to assist small business. You submit a one-page application, and 30 minutes later, the money is in your bank account.
Well, we're talking about capitalist states, though, so Assad's right.
Yeah, but here it's been a complete disaster.
That's what we're trying to say. I also want to go back a little bit to the kind of the ruling class and the ruling class, the different different fractions within the capitalist class. I mean, I remember when Trump was first elected, there was a lot of talk about, a lot of comparison in some left circles with the 18th Brumaire, and that what made Trump possible was actually the fact that the capitalist class wasn't able to organize itself in any sensible way. And so then Trump was able to mobilize a particular sector of the petite bourgeoisie or small business, or you can do a racially disinfected sector of white men, and craft a kind of, an electoral strategy that brought him into government. And so it would not be called a successful ruling class or capitalist class strategy. It would be a fraction of the capitalist class allying with,
I think
and then he bought off the big boys with tax cuts and deregulation.
Yeah,
So,
there we go. Yep.
Asad?
I think Marx's argument is that in this period in which there is a failure of different fractions of the capitalist class to align, the individual despotism of Bonaparte was able to organize the capitalist class. It was a way of securing the stability of the capitalist order, relying on the conservative ideology of the peasantry. I mean, in a way that is quite reminiscent of the current moment. A disorganization, a disequilibrium of the political system in which an individual figure is able to step in and mobilize a conservative ideology in order to provide a stability that wasn't there before. I think that is...
I'm not sure I'd call it stability.
No.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, well, look, I mean, the fact that the capitalist state fails to adequately organize the capitalist class doesn't mean that that isn't what it's setting out to do. It is setting out to do that, and it's not doing it well.
Trump didn't even need to begin to think.
Example is a good one and a relevant one, and that's why you ought to be very worried about a second Trumpist term, and you ought to be very worried about doing away with the rule of law. And Marx would have been very worried by it, precisely because it doesn't leave room for socialist forces to organize. It becomes a means of suppressing and repressing and scattering and exiling the very forces that tried to make the 1848 revolutions. And let's remember, the 18th Brumaire is written in the wake of the failure of those revolutions, which the manifesto was written for. So one needs to be looking very, very carefully at the consequences of this type of a scoundrel being put into state office in this way. And that's why it's important to be thinking about what the outcome will be in November, not because one expects very much out of Biden, but at least in order to ensure that there is space for the left to continue to operate.
But I want to add another point, Leo, which is that, just as much as we might understand the capitalist state as the organizer of the capitalist class, it's at the same time the disorganizer of the working class. This is the other thing it does. It disorganizes.
Yes and no. Yes and no. It helps the working class organize insofar as it gives, let's say, unions legislative rights, and the condition for those legislative rights is that they can't go on strike. It helps the working class organize insofar as it turns people who were union organizers into petty lawyers processing grievances to labor boards. In other words, it organizes or helps organize the class in a way that is not transformative. And I think Poulantzas was wrong in that sense, in that general claim about the disorganization of the class. The whole point about corporatist developments on the part of trade unions is that they get embedded in class harmony-oriented political structures. So they also operate on the terrain of the state and in a way that is part of the organization of the state to reproduce the system. What we need is the type of organization of the class, and there are chinks in the state in this respect that provides openings for transformative working class institutions to develop. And there are capitalist societies in which it is not illegal to go on strike during the course of a contract. These things can be won. In the constitutions after 1945, the right to strike was embedded in the constitutions of Italy and France because of the power of the communist parties at that point in time, operating inside the state. So it depends. This is a historic question, not an abstract one.
Anyone else? I've got a question here. I was saying towards the beginning, I said people are scared to go to work. Actually, I think I said they're actually scared to go out and consume. But they're also scared to go to work, and they're not particularly enthused about being forced to go back to work. The states that have shut down production, there's to get people back to work, you need to have better protections than they're capable of providing, but they're not providing them. So how are we going to get people back to work with such minimal provisions for protection of workers who may be too afraid to go back to the work?
I mean, isn't this the debate that's unfolding in these red states where the governors are saying things like, we can't, we won't provide unemployment for anyone who refuses to go back to work on the grounds that it's not safe. It's like, if you refuse to go back and you're called back, then you lose your unemployment benefits. So it seems like that the way that people are being forced to go back to work is by literally being forced to go back to work, right? You will not get unemployment benefits, and so you will starve. And then the kind of $600 extra, I don't know, COVID pay that it goes with unemployment insurance stops, was it July 1st? And so that's another way at the the larger federal level that there's a mechanism to try to coerce people back to work, just financially, saying that you don't have any you won't have your health care if you have that, and you won't have enough to live. So it seems like it's going to be basically it seems like people will be forced, and will they have the strength or the community support or the mechanism, I don't know what other mechanisms there would be, to not go back to work, right? The standoff is going to be like you starve or your work. And are people going to be willing to say, okay, I can rely on my community enough not to have to go back?
It's like that old bad 80s song, birth, school, work, death. Like we're really compressing that sequence very intensely here. Something that I've been thinking about, this is a bit of a departure, but working from home, which now seems to be the new way of doing things. And a lot of companies are talking about making this more or less permanent after that. What is that going to do to collective organization, to social ties, to consciousness of workers who will be further atomized. And the home space, which used to be a refuge from the pressures of accumulation, now will become so deeply penetrated by the boss. What is this going to do to our social lives?
Well, there's enormous class or intra-class differences here, obviously. And one needs to be very, very conscious of this. For a very large number of working class people, they don't have the possibility of working from home because they're engaged in collective processes of production or collective processes of care that can only be done on site. And for them, that doesn't arise. For many others, especially salaried employees, working from home will become more and more common, to such an extent, I think, that there will be a commercial real estate crisis because the vast floors of cubicles where people only communicate with one another already through the way we're communicating with one another, even if they're in the next cubicle. The irrationality of that, I think, will be recognized in the context of how this has operated during this, have been able to operate during this pandemic. So there's an intra-class divide here. There's a struggle to be conducted, a class struggle to be conducted around this. Are teachers, are university professors going to be content with distance education? Will they allow this to happen? Or will they see the educational process as a collective one that takes place on site, not simply through cyber relations? So there's room for class struggle around this. But I do think you're right, Doug, that in a great many of salaried and white collar occupations, one's going to see a change in the labor process of the kind you're describing, but it isn't going to extend to, by any means, the whole of the working class, far from it.
No, it's certainly not the whole working class, but it's going to be a lot of it.
Yeah.
I wanted to take up the education part because one of the things that we've already seen is how totally disadvantaged low-income students are by the move to remote learning, right? Let's say the household space will be smaller, the competition over bandwidth, or maybe the household's one laptop if they have one, so that the different kids can have a chance to do their, attend their online class or talk with their teacher or do their work. I mean, so there's no private, there's no special learning, there's no learning place in the household. The household is filled with a lot of people, the bandwidth, the privacy. I mean, it's completely a terrible way to actually eliminate education for a huge sector of people. I think this is one of the places where this is just a horrendous crime. You can't, and I'm pretty furious with Cuomo for talking about now going to go into some kind of cooperation. I don't remember with which media mogul, but maybe it was
Gates and Schmidt.
Yeah. Oh my God! So it's really to the belly of the beast. So it get Eric Schmidt. So that this is a terrible thing for the state's low-income kids. I mean, they will be further and further behind in like a permanent uneducated class, and this is a horrible tragedy. I mean, I don't think we can say enough about the class struggle at the level of education. That's just a massive fight, and it's starting now, and it's got to be. I mean, I also worry about the university system. I mean, my college just cut everybody's salary, and they didn't lay off any of the untenured people or the temporary people, but they cut everyone's salary. And who knows? I mean, that's just one place. A lot of other places are having it a lot worse with huge layoffs. So it'll be interesting to see how university workers if university workers are going to be able to organize, right? They're not, maybe we can take leadership from the work that graduate student unions have been doing, but that's still a small sector of schools where they've had where they've had successes there. So I'm not actually, I'm concerned about the education part of the, staying at home. It's like neoliberal privatization now done to a micro level, like to the level of the household rather than just the firm. And we'll see, we've also seen amounts of domestic violence occurring because of people staying at home, and that's increased dramatically. So education and then the violence against women is going to be, it's a huge issue.
Well, I think, Doug, that your question leads us to another very important question, which is what forms of collective organization can we envision in the context of social distancing?
Yes, that's an excellent question.
This is a huge challenge for us right now. And, of course, a lot of people have been talking to Mike Davis as, a kind of a flu expert, and he keeps saying we can't yield the street. We still have to be out there demonstrating on the street 6 feet apart. Well, okay. But when you have demonstrations, you have a demonstration every once in a while. Most of the time, you just have meetings. You just have meetings with 20, 30 people in a room. And that's what it takes to actually organize a demonstration. We can't do that right now. We're going to be—
It's all on Zoom now, right?
It's going to be on Zoom. Well, things don't work the same on Zoom. I think that the problems of atomization and so on that you're describing in terms of work, they're a huge barrier to organization. I don't know that we know the solution to that yet.
At the level we're operating at, I've been involved in a number of these types of conversations that the world transformed in Britain, which was an offshoot of Momentum, engaged in political education at Labour Party conferences and between conferences. I'm part of a webinar around this book, Searching for Socialism, that they're doing. And they are getting 300-400 people to be— I was on today with Hillary Wainwright to be discussing these questions, and then thousands of people to watch them afterwards. When I compare that to what I was doing with TWT meetings in London or at fringe meetings, a Labour Party conference, it's reaching a hell of a lot more people. And when I think about how much conversation that produced amongst the people there, as opposed to a few questions at the end that would be posed to us, I'm not sure it's all that different. In other words, I'm not sure that the way we were organizing before in the DSA or Momentum was, all that more productive than the kinds of video cyber connections we're now doing. But I entirely agree that cyber connections are not the way we are going to build the movement primarily. I think that's certainly true.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in political meetings on Zoom like 4 days a week, right? It's even more than before Zoom, because everybody knows, like, well, I know you're not going to be away from home, so let's just scoot in an hour here. And so there's like and at first it was like, well, let's reassure everyone. And then it was like, well, I know you're not busy, so let's do this. And in fact, it's, it's been even more meetings. So, and a lot of the meetings right now are for planning a bunch of actions next weekend that include an outdoor socially distanced protest and a couple of car caravans. So I don't think it's the same as massive crowds in the street, that's for sure. But at the level of actually organizing, it's not been that much of a pain.
Organizing towards what, though?
Or crowds towards what? I mean, let's not, let appearing in the streets appear to be itself a strategy. That's been part of our problem, of course, over the last 20, 25 years, that we've been good at organizing at crowds, as Jodi put it, without being able to take that anywhere beyond that strategically. So it's important to be visible in the street to give people that sense of a collective protest, but it's not enough in itself either.
I'm not sure we were good at crowds. We had crowds, but I don't think we ever thought through them adequately. I think because we still need crowds. This is the point that you have a Bernie Sanders campaign and you still need the assembly, but the assembly has to function. And I don't think we thought through that. You know, in Occupy, I don't think we succeeded with it, but then I think we jumped over to say, okay, forget that. That was a delusion. Now we've moved on to more important stuff, winning elections. I think this is the wrong way to think about it. We still need the crowds and we need to do them better.
Well, how would we
doesn't
be
have
doing
to
it better?
be one or the other. Sorry, Doug.
I just asking Asad to develop that. How would we do crowds better?
I think that, we have these, in Occupy, we had spontaneous forms of assembly, and we didn't have continuous organizational structures that went between these moments of suddenly people gathering that could structure assemblies in such a way that they could achieve things and that they could make meaningful decisions. We didn't have forms of democracy that existed in spaces beyond just these occupations, that existed at people's workplaces and people's neighborhoods. They existed in these very confined ways, just in this kind of spectacular moment. And I think that that wasn't adequately organized, but at the same time, abandoning the idea of having popular assemblies, that's also a mistake.
I can give an example. I remember the February 5th demonstration here against the Iraq War in Toronto, one of the largest demonstrations in recent decades, and how exciting that was. And then coming back from it and realizing there was no organizational structure to take that anywhere. There was no organizational structure to allow that to be reproduced in an ongoing way apart from a moment. In Britain, the Stop the War campaign did have that kind of organizational structure right down to the local level. And many of the activists who were mobilized around Stop the War came out of the woodwork in 2015 to get Jeremy Corbyn elected as leader of the Labour Party. It left an organizational residue, right? And that's what we need. That's the kind of attitude we need to have in the sense of building out of popular big mobilizations. I think that's what we need to be looking towards. But we shouldn't be imagining that getting people out on the street in itself is by any means enough.
Well, Jodi, you wrote the book on crowds versus party. What are your thoughts here?
I think that crowds I've really been worrying about the absence of crowds, actually, Doug. So it's funny that you ask about that, because that's the one thing that we're not really supposed to have as people trying to prevent the spread of this virus, is not supposed to be in massive crowds. And that's it feels like a loss, because crowds in space give a sense of something else is possible, right? Things can change. The status quo doesn't have to be there. And I don't mean any crowd. I mean crowds that are not organized by capital in the state. And not having them feels politically bereft. And so we've had to make other kinds of political choices in the absence of crowds. But I think maybe that's why, these right-wing protests, even though they're such a small amount of the population, right? They're not in any way representative. They're very small. They've got, big money funders, but they seem like something, because they are getting crowds out at a time when we're not seeing crowds very much. And I think that feels, even when people recognize, there's our Looney Tunes, whatever, that there's some kind of pressure that they exert just by being a crowd. And then the role of the party is to take the crowd moment and channel it politically, right? A crowd doesn't have its own politics. The party, in my theorization, then will channel that energy of the crowd. And so now what parties are having to do is channel energy without the crowds. And it seems, very artificial, right? Trump's super worried about it not being able to have his rallies, and the Biden efforts are occasions for a great deal of hilarity because his lack of functionality with good social media. So, yeah.
Well, we're down to the last 15 minutes of this. So this is the time, I guess, to look ahead, as we journalists do in our debased way. Can something good come out of this hellscape?
It's sort of perverse question in a way, right? Like, I always feel like finding something good is not just a silver lining, but there's something sort of perverse of like, the bright side of the bubonic plague. When you say it like that, right? But now you're saying, well, what's the bright side of the?
Well, it was phrased as a question.
Yeah, I mean, we not to be super moralistic, but we should say, right? What is it? Over 90,000 people in the United States have died, or around 90,000 people in the United States have died, and across the world, what's the number of deaths? Is it 300,000 people died?
Well, we have like a quarter of them, so yeah, multiply by 4. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that seems something worth, kind of sitting with and acknowledging. And then I would say, as socialists and communists, we should say that the laying bare of the contradictions and laying bare of the both the contradictions of capitalism and the fragility of its order, that those are both those are both developments that can be useful for our politics.
I think it's going to be revealed that for all of the success of the central banks, above all, the World Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, in containing this from becoming a financial conflagration, an uncontrolled one, apart from that, managing this is going to be extremely difficult. And the contradictions in capitalist states trying to manage it is going to be revealed. It is being revealed, and it's going to be revealed all the more. It's going to magnify the extent to which the states of the quote unquote developing world are not given the types of room, facilities, capacity to deal with the problem as the pandemic sweeps there, because the central banks are taking care of the advanced capitalist world primarily. It's going to expose the ugliness of a transnational capitalist system and a financial system, I think. So because of the difficulty of managing this, that is not to say that, when things get worse, the prospects for socialism necessarily get better. But I think that does give us space. And then I want to come back to where we started. Look, for there to have been a popularizing of the word socialism, however much that may have been social democratic in its aspirations, i.e. what I want is Denmark, or even worse, what I want is Canada. For the word socialism to be legitimated in so many eyes behind the campaign for universal public health care, just before this happened, my God, that gives us a basis for continuing to develop class consciousness in the United States. In Britain, while I entirely agree with Jodi about the class differences around broadband not being necessarily changed by this, given the conditions working class people live in, et cetera, Corbyn's demand, the Labour Party's demand in the 2019 December election for public free broadband was derided by most people as a bribe to the voters. Now you see it as an essential service. Here in Toronto, there were lines down the block for people to get into Service Canada to put in their unemployment claims. And you realize it's because people don't have broadband at home. They go to the library or the coffee shop in order to be able to put in an application. That itself created a health crisis. So there is an opening here for us to make a case for common ownership in all kinds of spheres. And Jodi was right to point right at the beginning for the need for planning in order for that to happen, for the need for finance to be a public utility, whatever concretely that ever means. Doug and I are always worrying over
Yeah.
how to translate that practically.
It's a nice slogan.
It's a nice slogan. And it's actually an essential idea. But how to do it in a way that connects with the type of planning that we need to be getting on the agenda. You know, I think we have a lot of reasons to feel that we've got some wind behind our sails, rather than be depressing ourselves with how terrible these capitalist states are proving to be.
Asad?
Yeah, I think that I believe that this moment is one of major transformation. We have many surprises ahead. I don't think we have a good idea of what's in store for us. I think a lot will change. At the same time, some things I think remain consistent, and I think in some senses those are the most fundamental things. If we look over the whole history of the 20th century, the scale of devastation that capitalism has wreaked on the world is extreme. We've already seen extreme levels of starvation, imperialist terrorism, genocide. This is all part of the history of capitalism up to the present. We've always been fighting against this. And we have an exceptional moment now, but the underlying problem is still there. And the response is still the same. The response is to say that we should live in a world in which nobody goes hungry. That has not changed. And the challenge of realizing that has not changed. We always had to present an affirmative politics. Politics never, an emancipatory politics was never simply given by a situation. It was never the automatic result of a crisis, as though suddenly the crisis revealed to everyone that the system is rotten and then we would have this transformation. You always had to have the affirmative proposal of an emancipatory politics, which said we can live differently than how we live. We still need that. And what we need, just as we needed before, is a program and a strategy and an organization which can implement an emancipatory politics. And we have not found the solution to that yet. Many attempts were tried throughout the 20th century. I believe that we have to learn from their failures just as much from their successes. I don't believe we can just implement a model and say, well, okay, let's bring back the party and that will solve it. I think this is a major challenge that we have to think through anew in the present.
So
You're here.
But what is, I mean, isn't that what intellectuals always say? Oh, everything we need new concepts. We have to think through this anew. No, we need to go back. We need to think about all this stuff. It's like, well, sure. Leo's like shaking his head, but it seems like this is the line that intellectuals always have, is that, we have to think about things. And no one's going to say, don't think, for crying out loud, right? So if one recognizes that what's necessary is a program and a strategy and organization, then being involved in an organization capable, an organization that has a program and that can try to implement a strategy is a step forward. And to say, well, I don't see one that exists, okay, that's something, right? But then that just sort of dooms one to be in a place without a program and without a strategy. So I take the view that one needs to be in a party to put forward these arguments and to make that kind of strategy happen. Because if not, the general left can't form a strategy. That's not what a general left does. A crowd can't form a strategy. A movement can't form a strategy, but organizations within movements can form strategies. So if we recognize the importance of strategy, then that means building the organizations capable of implementing them.
Let me appoint myself Assad's defense attorney. I thought that's what he was saying, Jodi. It really took him to be saying exactly that. And he didn't begin by saying we need to rethink, we need to think. He said we need to assert that nobody should go hungry. We need to assert a necessity of emancipation. And then he said, we need to find the means of doing that. Now, I think he was quite right then to say, there isn't a party form out there that we can latch on to. We are in the process of discovery. One doesn't exist. And in any case, there won't be a single one. And part of the problem with the small parties that emerged out of the crisis of the large ones in the 1960s was that each of them thought they had the formula. That was one of the problems. And unfortunately, most of them were borrowing that formula from the Bolshevik Revolution in a very different context in a very different time.
And so then the next set of responses is, so, you know, I'll just keep talking about it and then talk about developing the form, rather than being in the small party to try to build it and let it adapt to something, right? So it doesn't mean that there were these kind of, you know, all these problems with the proliferation of small parties in the 70s doesn't mean that that parties are hopeless, right? That conclusion isn't right.
Well, who's concluding that?
But I think the way that you keep stopping before you get to what organizational form you think would be possible. Right. And what I'm saying is that I think you develop that organizational form through practice.
I agree.
Within the organization.
You want to send me a membership card, Jodi? You know, we have tiny little parties. We're trying to build ones that have much greater capacities. And we haven't discovered how to do that. We need to, yes, I would entirely agree. We need to be trying to do that.
Asad, do you want to have the last word?
Well, I'll just end by adding even more controversy. And I just want to say, look, there's a very difficult task we have to do when we think about the history of the 20th century revolutions, which is to recognize that with the model of the party, the Revolutionary Party, they achieved a scale of transformation that seems almost unthinkable to us today. But at the same time, that this was a severe limitation on the scope of their emancipatory potential, because when the party became the state, human emancipation was foreclosed. And I think that we have to think of a form of emancipation. We have to think, and people think, everybody thinks, people think every day. Workers think, it's not just intellectuals, and they're capable of thinking of a kind of emancipation that goes beyond the party becoming the state. I think it's possible, and I think it's necessary.
All right, I think we should end it here. That's a good coda. Thanks to everyone. Asad, Jodi Dean, Leo Panich, Philip Wolsetter, and Sean operating behind the scenes. Thanks to everyone. And I'm sure other people operating behind the scenes, I don't even know. So thanks to all of you. Thanks for putting us all together, and onward to
thank you, Doug.
human liberation.
Thank you, Jodi, Asad, and Leo. I have to take the discussion down a notch now towards an appeal for money, even though I had all sorts of high-level questions to pose, but we will continue this discussion in various other panels and let Red May and no doubt outside it. But we do need some kind of financing to keep going. And we do have a website, which is www.redmayseattle.org. Just go and click donate on it, or you can do it through our YouTube Red May TV there. You can also subscribe to YouTube so you'll get the notice of what's coming. Tomorrow, discussion that to some extent will pick up off of this. It's what was liberalism? That's at 6. And also on Monday night, Jodi will be, Monday afternoon, Jodi will be back at 1 o'clock for communism or neo-feudalism, our kind of version of socialism or barbarism. You can read Jodi's article on that in the Los Angeles Review of Books. So home we go to think about accumulation and legitimation and all those wonderful questions that tie around party building and what moment are we in. and stay safe. And it was a pleasure listening to all of you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for putting us all together.
Thank you.